Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you're new here. Tonight we're taking a slow, candlelit stroll into a side of medieval history that rarely makes it into textbooks, the bedrooms of kings and queens. But don't expect lace curtains and sweet lullabies. No. Think power, scandal, and absolutely no concept of privacy. These were rooms where history got a little unbuttoned. Now, before we pull back the heavy velvet drapes and peer into these infamous chambers, let's take a moment. If you enjoy this kind of calm, curious exploration of the past, feel free to give the video a little thumbs up. Subscribe if you're into these low-lit journeys through dusty centuries. And I genuinely mean this, only if you enjoy what I do here. This isn't a royal decree, it's just a soft suggestion from your humble narrator. Also, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment down below. It's always fascinating to see this sleepy little corner of history stretching across time zones, from midnight listeners in Manila to early risers in Manchester. Now, I want you to really ease into this. Dim your lights. Maybe turn on a fan to get that steady, soft hum in the background. Adjust your blanket, sip your tea if you have some, and just let your shoulders drop. This isn't a lecture. It's a gentle unraveling of stories, whispered through time. You see, medieval royal bedrooms weren't just places for sleep. They were political stages, secret chambers of alliance and betrayal, spaces where power undressed itself, sometimes literally. Behind stone walls and thick tapestries, the lives of monarchs unfolded with all the drama of a soap opera, minus the commercials and a lot more embroidery. We often imagine kings and queens seated on thrones, issuing commands and fighting wars. But what about when the doors closed, when the crown came off and the candlelight flickered low? What happened in the stillness of those rooms, where power was less about armor and more about desire, fear, indulgence, and secrecy? Tonight we tiptoe into that world, not to mock, but to observe, to understand that behind every royal title was a very human person, often flawed, often foolish, occasionally fascinating. And don't worry, we're not diving in all at once. We'll take our time like a servant slowly drawing back the curtains. One figure at a time, one room, one story, carefully, quietly. So where shall we begin? Let's start with a king whose appetite, both for power and pleasure, left even the monks shaking their heads. He ruled with a heavy hand and an even heavier heart, but it was his bedroom that held the real secrets. First up, King John. Yes, that King John. The one who signed the Magna Carta and possibly broke every other commandment on his way to doing it. Ready? Let's go. Meet King John, the guy who made losing half of France look like the least of his problems. Known to history as John Lackland, and possibly remembered by dinner hosts as the worst guest in British history, he ruled England from 1199 to 1216. And oh, what a reign it was. Chaotic, embarrassing, and somehow both underwhelming and overwhelming at once. Let's start with the basics. John inherited the throne after the death of his big brother, Richard the Lionheart. You know, the crusading hero, lion emblem and all. Compared to Richard, John was more like a wet cat. He didn't roar. He sulked, schemed, and occasionally shrieked, usually when things didn't go his way. Which, to be fair, was often. Politically, he was a walking cautionary tale. Under his watch, England lost Normandy and most of its French territories, a massive, humiliating blow. His barons despised him, foreign rulers mocked him, and even the Pope got fed up enough to excommunicate him. Then there was the Magna Carta. He didn't sign it because he believed in liberty or fairness. He signed it because a bunch of angry barons had cornered him and left him no choice. It was more of a hostage negotiation than a royal decree. But if you think that's bad, wait until we step into his personal life. This is where John truly earned his reputation, not as a ruler, but as a royal menace. You see, John had a rather aggressive approach to romance. He didn't just take lovers, he took them, sometimes literally, He had a nasty habit of pursuing noble women, whether or not they were interested, and whether or not they were already married. He'd lure them in, or more often, simply have them taken and locked up in castles. Yes, castles. Plural. He wasn't subtle about it either. According to one chronicler, John did not abstain from the wives and daughters of his nobles, which, translated from medieval historian speak, means he turned every holiday gathering into a family scandal. If your wife or daughter caught his eye, you either sent her to a convent or prayed he got distracted by someone else's misfortune. This wasn't just creepy, it was strategic. By seducing or stealing noble women, John destabilized families, divided loyalties, and ensured that potential rebels were too busy untangling personal disasters to unite against him. It was politics by pillow, and John was the worst kind of matchmaker. Even medieval scribes, who tended to overlook everything from torture to witch burnings, couldn't stay silent. They didn't often editorialize, but when they mentioned John, they couldn't resist a little passive-aggressive shade. One wrote that he was not temperate with women. That's about as close as you get in the 13th century to calling someone a complete creep. And it wasn't just gossip. His behavior stirred real consequences. Nobles were furious, not just at the taxes or the failed wars, but at the sheer disrespect. John's behavior didn't just offend morality, it offended property rights. Because in that world, wives and daughters were tragically seen as political assets, and John was treating those assets like they were party favors. His royal bedroom escapades weren't just shameful, they were dangerous. England teetered on the edge of civil war more than once, not because of treaties or trade routes, but because John couldn't keep his crown out of other people's households. And as we move forward, we'll see just how close his lust brought the kingdom to total collapse. If King John had a talent for anything, it was excess. And no, not the fun kind. Unless your idea of fun includes 30 mistresses, dozens of angry barons, and a royal schedule that reads more like a tavern wall than a court calendar. Yes, 30 mistresses. That's not romance, that's a logistics nightmare. Noble women, servants, ladies-in-waiting, if they had a pulse and were in proximity to power, John seemed to believe they were fair game. His court wasn't a palace. It was more like an unregulated social experiment with no HR department. Naturally, the nobles noticed. How could they not? Their wives, sisters, and daughters kept disappearing into castles and reappearing with very awkward stories and even more awkward inheritances. The official complaints began to pile up, not about war, not about taxes, but about abusing hospitality. That's medieval legalese for, this guy's sleeping with everyone, possibly even the goat. One baron reportedly insisted that any future meeting with the king must occur only after his entire household had been locked away, literally, behind doors. No council unless my wife is under guard. That's not paranoia, that's 13th century diplomacy. But here's the kicker, John genuinely believed he was irresistible. In his letters and proclamations, there's a whiff of smug self-assurance, like a man who thinks winking is a policy move. He didn't see himself as a predator or a problem. He saw himself as a royal Casanova, blessed by charm and God's divine right to flirt disastrously. This delusion ran so deep, he even issued orders that suggest he thought his presence was a gift. He'd ride ahead to castles, requesting certain chambers, certain meals, and, of course, certain company. He thought it was chivalry. Everyone else thought it was cause for rebellion. The tension finally boiled over. The barons, already exhausted by John's losses in France and his creative approach to taxation, now had personal stakes. He wasn't just messing with politics, he was messing with their families. And in medieval England, that was the quickest way to end up on the wrong side of a rebellion. By the end, his kingdom was in turmoil, his court was a running joke, and democracy, as awkwardly medieval as it was born just to keep him away from wives and daughters. That's right. The Magna Carta, often romanticized as the root of modern liberty, was at least partially fueled by one king's inability to keep his robe tied. As for his legacy, chaos, distrust, a few scattered children that no one at court really wanted to talk about. You know it's bad when your death is met more with relief than mourning, and when the most flattering thing chroniclers can say is, "At least he's gone." So, what's next? We move from scandalous seduction to scandalous delusion, with Charles VI of France, a king whose love life wasn't the problem, but whose mind certainly was. Charles VI of France began his reign with all the makings of a legendary monarch. Young, elegant, politically astute, he seemed poised to carry the Valois dynasty to new heights. Crowned at the tender age of 11 and ruling in full by 20, Charles was a golden boy with golden intentions. But behind the coronation glitter lay a ticking clock. The man who once embodied royal promise would soon earn a darker title, Charles the Mad. The signs arrived slowly, like a fog creeping over the Seine. One moment, he was presiding over court with practiced grace. The next, he was staring blankly at his wife, unable to remember her name, or his own. By his mid-20s, his condition had turned from concerning to catastrophic. In one infamous episode, Charles violently attacked members of his own guard, chasing them with a drawn sword in what he believed was an ambush. The real ambush, of course, was inside his own mind. And then came the glass. Yes, glass. Charles became convinced that he was made entirely of the fragile stuff. He refused to be touched, walked gingerly through corridors, and insisted on being wrapped in thick blankets, lest he shatter. This wasn't poetic fragility. It was a very real and very impractical delusion that had his attendants tiptoeing around him like nervous waiters with a teetering tray of crystal goblets. Through it all, he managed to maintain, if only in technicality, a romantic life. Enter Odette de Champdivers, a mistress with the patience of a saint and the timing of a tragic novel. She provided comfort as the king withdrew from reality, becoming a kind of unofficial nursemaid to a man whose mind wandered farther with each passing year. Meanwhile, Charles juggled hallucinations, civil war, and royal responsibilities in a way that can only be described as dysfunctional multitasking. Back at court, his queen Isabeau of Bavaria was left to pick up the glittering pieces, while Charles mumbled about shattering and refused to bathe for weeks on end, because apparently soap posed a danger to imaginary glass limbs. Isabeau held diplomatic meetings, negotiated alliances, and tried not to scream. The irony of it all? She was often painted as the unstable one by later historians, while Charles sat in a corner swaddled in wool and whispering to mirrors he refused to look into. And yet, despite his delusions, Charles remained entangled in the trappings of kingship. He still received visitors. He still issued decrees, though often incoherent. He still had dinners, where guests nervously smiled as their monarch asked to be seated gently, lest the throne splinter him into shards. It was a royal court turned absurdist play, a kingdom ruled by a man at war with his own body and mind. Charles's story, tragic as it is, can't help but feel tinged with a bizarre sense of wonder. This was a man who fought invisible enemies, feared shattering from a sneeze, and still had a mistress. A king wrapped in blankets, wrapped in power, wrapped in chaos. But perhaps the most surreal chapter of his reign was yet to come. It involved Odette, fire, dancing nobles, and an event that would turn the French court into a cautionary tale of excess, miscalculation, and flaming fur costumes. In the shadow of Charles VI's unraveling mind stood Odette de Champdivers, a woman whose name barely appears in the official records, yet whose presence kept a broken king wrapped in something resembling stability. Whether it was love, loyalty, or just surviving the role she'd been handed, Odette took it all in quiet stride. She wasn't a queen, but she did everything a queen might have done. Brushed the king's hair, listened patiently as he whispered about shattering like glass, and dressed him carefully in thick padded garments so he could walk without fear of cracking. It was a love story told through wool, worry, and unwavering patience. When she was introduced at court, it wasn't with trumpets or titles. More like sidelong glances and hushed whispers. Odette was the medieval version of "don't ask, just smile." She knew her role, stayed out of politics, and somehow made space for herself in a world that didn't welcome unofficial women. Through Charles's worst episodes, she was the one person who didn't recoil, who sat beside the glass king and helped him believe, at least for a moment, that he was still a man. But even Odette couldn't shield him from disaster. In 1393, the court held a masquerade known as the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It was meant to be light-hearted entertainment. Charles and a few companions dressed as wild men, covered in flax soaked in resin and pitch, their bodies flammable but their spirits high. The idea? To dance like forest spirits and surprise the guests. Medieval fun, apparently. And then someone brought a torch. As music played and dancers whirled, a torch was carelessly dropped, some say by the king's brother, Louis of Orleans, who entered late and drunk, holding fire in the middle of a flammable circus. In seconds, flames tore through the ballroom. Screams echoed against the stone walls. 4 of the dancers died, burned alive in their costumes. One man leapt into a vat of wine to extinguish himself. Another was smothered under a noblewoman's skirts. Charles survived barely, thanks to a quick-thinking lady-in-waiting, who wrapped him in her gown and shielded him from the flames. But whatever remained of his dignity, the illusion of a stable king, was gone. His crown may have stayed on, but his reputation? Burned to a crisp. Odette stood by him through it all, watching as the court whispered, as the people murmured, as the cracks in the monarchy grew louder than any royal decree. She didn't leave, she didn't demand titles, she just stayed, quiet and unshakable, until Charles's spiral dragged the entire kingdom toward madness. The Bal des Ardents marked more than a tragedy. It was the theatrical peak of a reign gone off the rails. A man who thought he was glass had now become a symbol of fire and chaos. And behind the blaze, Odette lingered like a footnote the scribes never knew how to write. Charles VI would father many children, legitimate and otherwise, but his legacy wouldn't rest in heirs. It would echo in broken mirrors, scorched halls, and a mistress who knew better than to hope for a happy ending. In the bloody theater of medieval kingship, no one performed passion quite like Peter of Castile. Known to his supporters as Pedro the Just, and to his enemies as Pedro el Cruel, he ruled from 1350 to 1369 with equal parts charm, paranoia, and a taste for vengeance. At first glance, he was everything a medieval monarch should be: handsome, intelligent, decisive. But under the crown simmered something far more dangerous. A man who confused love with possession and loyalty with fear. At the center of his obsessions stood Maria de Padilla, the woman who would define his reign far more than any battle or treaty. Maria wasn't a queen, at least not officially, not until years after her death, when Peter declared her his one true wife and retroactively crowned her from the grave. Before that, she was simply the woman he refused to let go of. Their relationship began before Peter's arranged marriage to Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess chosen more for diplomacy than desire. But Peter had no interest in political brides, especially not when Maria was still in the picture. Legend has it that Peter abandoned Blanche just 3 days after their wedding. Why? Because Maria, as the court whispered, had prettier hair. Blanche was locked away in a fortress, while Peter returned to Maria's arms. For over a decade, Blanche remained imprisoned, writing letters to anyone who might listen, and aging in silence behind stone walls. Peter rarely mentioned her, except when accusing her of treason, mostly to justify her captivity. In one account, when a bishop suggested Blanche should at least be treated with dignity, Peter reportedly replied, "She is where she cannot shame me." Medieval chivalry, redefined. Meanwhile, Maria lived in relative comfort, though comfort is a generous word when loving Peter meant living on the edge of court scandal, political assassination, and the occasional mass execution. Still, she bore him 4 children, maintained a quiet power behind the scenes, and, by all accounts, held Peter's complete and dangerous devotion. When Maria died in 1361, Peter's grief was spectacular. He wept publicly, wore mourning for months, and, most famously, ordered that she be buried with full royal honors. Then, in a twist no one saw coming, he retroactively declared her his lawful wife and Queen of Castile. It was like rewriting history with a dagger instead of a pen. And that's just the love story. Because while Peter's heart belonged to Maria, his hands were often soaked in blood. Courtiers disappeared. Nobles were executed. Even family members weren't safe from his fits of jealousy or vengeance. His idea of romantic loyalty included having rivals strangled, ex-lovers tortured, and rumors silenced permanently. One poet of the time wrote, "He loved as he ruled, with a blade behind his back." Ultimately, Peter's obsession with Maria and his ruthless policies caught up with him. In 1369, he was lured into a trap by his own half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. In a dimly lit tent, after a scuffle that could rival any Shakespearean climax, Peter was stabbed to death. Henry emerged victorious, proclaiming, "I did not kill a king. I killed a tyrant." But even after death, Peter's legend endured. Part tragic lover, part homicidal monarch, all-consuming drama. His ghost, they say, still haunts the Alcazar of Seville, wandering the halls where he once whispered to Maria, killed his enemies, and redefined what it meant to die for love. Peter the Cruel never did settle. For him, love was either worship or war, no middle ground, no safe exits. And when affection turned cold or someone dared to leave, the results were less tragic love story and more gruesome autopsy report. Take Doña Juana de Castro, one of Peter's short-lived romantic obsessions. Their marriage, if you can call it that, was hastily arranged, questionably legal, and, for Juana, fatal. When she tried to leave him, Peter responded not with flowers or letters, but with something far more final. She was later found in pieces, literally. It was a breakup so extreme, not even the court poets attempted a sonnet. Peter wasn't shy about his brutality. In fact, he watched executions like they were theater, lounging on palace balconies with a mistress in his lap and a goblet in hand. Some monarchs held court over laws. Peter held court over death. His favorite backdrop for romance? The clink of chains and the final gurgle of a traitor's last breath. Gossip in Peter's court moved faster than wine. One day, he was seen kissing a court lady. The next, her brother was missing. Another time, he ordered a surprise wedding. On the same day, he had the groom hanged. Love and vendetta blurred so often, even his closest advisors needed therapy. Medieval HR simply called it Tuesday. Peter's love, one jaded courtier quipped, is like a sword dance, beautiful to watch, terrible to join. Despite all this, Peter clung to the idea that his heart was pure, just tragically misunderstood. He viewed violence as proof of sincerity. To love Peter was to accept that affection might come with a dagger in the back, or at best, a forced relocation to a monastery. But his version of romantic justice would ultimately come full circle. In 1369, Peter was lured into a tent by his half-brother Henry of Trastamara under the guise of peace talks. There, in a scene better suited to a revenge opera than a royal summit, Henry stabbed Peter to death in front of witnesses. A symbolic act of family therapy, one historian joked centuries later, just with more blood and fewer hugs. And so ended Peter's reign of love and terror, his twisted passion silenced not by diplomacy, but by fratricide. As the torches dimmed over Castile and the balconies were scrubbed clean, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. Across the channel, another monarch was stirring, not with swords and executions, but with scandals of a different flavor. Edward II of England was about to take the throne, and while his reign would feature less visible blood, it would offer its own brand of royal discomfort, particularly in the company he kept and the whispers they inspired. Because if Peter made love fatal, Edward would make it controversial. Edward II of England wasn't known for battlefield brilliance, unless you count brilliant losses. He famously fumbled the Battle of Bannockburn, one of the worst military defeats in English history. But what Edward lacked in military finesse, he made up for in unshakable devotion. to one man in particular, Piers Gaveston. Piers wasn't royalty, nor a war hero, nor even especially subtle. He was Edward's childhood friend, his constant companion, and, according to many, a bit more than just a confidant. The rumors didn't exactly whisper. They shouted from every medieval tavern and court hall. Edward lavished titles upon Piers like confetti at a royal wedding. Duke, Earl, Lord. If the crown had a spare title lying around, it probably ended up pinned to Gaveston's tunic. And that tunic? It shimmered. Piers wore more jewels than the royal regalia, strutting through court like he owned it. To the nobles, this was more than a scandal. It was an insult. They hadn't bled for the crown just to be outranked by a man whose main qualification was his ability to entertain Edward with French poetry and private jokes. And then there was Queen Isabella, daughter of the King of France, a political prize and nobody's fool. She came with a dowry, the court whispered, not a shared throne. Isabella watched in quiet fury as Edward sidelined her for Piers, publicly, unapologetically, and with increasing recklessness. At feasts, Piers sat beside the king while Isabella watched from the far end of the table. When nobles objected, Edward simply exiled Gaveston, then brought him back. Repeatedly, like a bad habit with a crown-shaped key. But the nobles weren't just annoyed, they were humiliated. In 1312 they snapped. A coalition of lords kidnapped Gaveston, executed him without trial, and left Edward devastated. The king's mourning was not dignified. He wept, raged, and swore revenge. But the nobles had made their point. The kingdom was not Edward's to turn into a personal romance novel. If Edward had learned anything from Piers's fate, he didn't show it. Because soon, Hugh Despenser entered the picture. Where Piers had been flashy, Hugh was calculating, ambitious, and just as detested. He wormed his way into Edward's heart and treasury, helping himself to land, gold, and influence. Nobles seethed. Queen Isabella? She didn't seethe. She plotted. It would take time, but Isabella would go from sidelined queen to full-blown revolutionary. Her fury, once ignored, would burn through the court like dry thatch. The next chapter in Edward's story would not be written by sycophants or lovers, but by a betrayed wife and an army behind her. As for Piers Gaveston, he remains one of history's most controversial figures. Was it true love, political blindness, or both? One courtier famously remarked, "Edward lost a battle to the Scots, but lost his crown to his heart." After the tragic spectacle of Piers Gaveston, you'd think Edward II might learn a lesson about showering favorites with excessive power. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger, a man who didn't just whisper in the king's ear, he practically co-signed royal decrees. Hugh wasn't content to be adored, he wanted land, influence, and complete control. Under Edward's protection, he gobbled up estates like a hungry tax collector at a feast. Nobles who spoke out, exiled, imprisoned, occasionally disappeared. Hugh had no chill and zero political subtlety. One chronicler called him basically the second king. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella, the very image of royal restraint just a few years prior, was not amused. She tolerated Piers with tightly clenched teeth. But Hugh? Hugh was something else. Greedy, cruel, and dangerously close to stripping her sons of their inheritance. And so, the Queen made a pivot worthy of a Game of Thrones plot twist. Isabella crossed the Channel to France, secured an alliance with her husband's biggest rival, and found herself a new partner, Roger Mortimer, a disgraced noble with a grudge and a sword. Together, they built an army, a cause, and what was essentially a medieval divorce powered by military conquest. When Isabella returned to England in 1326, she was no longer the sidelined consort. She was a vengeance avatar in full regalia, greeted by cheering crowds and nobles tired of Despenser's tyranny. Edward and Hugh fled, badly. They were caught within weeks. Hugh was executed in true 13th century nightmare fashion, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered before a public audience, a punishment as theatrical as his crimes. As for Edward, his fate was quieter. but infinitely darker. Stripped of his crown, he was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. Officially, he died in captivity of natural causes. Unofficially, rumor had it he met his end via a red-hot poker inserted in a most undignified location. A brutal, symbolic punishment designed to mock his private life and humiliate him in death. One chronicler wrote it with grim flair. They destroyed the body to silence the tongue. Historians still debate the accuracy, but in the public imagination, Edward's reign, already a chaotic soap opera of favoritism, failed wars, and marital rebellion, ended with a flaming exclamation mark. His legacy? Not exactly royal inspiration. Between his battlefield blunders, excessive devotion to his favorites, and gruesome end, Edward II remains one of history's cautionary tales. A king brought down by love, pride, and the wrong advisors. If you pitch this to Netflix, they'd call it too much. But medieval England? It just called it Tuesday. Some kings leave behind empires. Some leave behind reforms. Wenceslaus of Bohemia? He left behind hangovers and question marks. Born with impressive credentials, King of the Romans, King of Bohemia, and fluent in 5 languages, you'd think Wenceslaus was poised for greatness. Instead, he ruled from the bottom of a wine goblet, delivering policy with all the clarity of a barred, mid-ale-fueled ballad. The man drank like it was a diplomatic obligation. His royal court became a rolling tavern. Reports tell of drinking sessions that lasted several days, where debates over taxes ended with someone flipping the table and Wenceslaus asleep underneath it. One scribe politely noted, "His Majesty was frequently horizontal. When he wasn't drinking, he was either flirting or forgetting." Affairs with barmaids, noblewomen, and even merchants' wives became court entertainment. They weren't just dalliances, they were practically job interviews. If you brought wine and could giggle at his jokes, you were halfway to a title. But nothing topped the nudity. Yes, Wenceslaus had a flair for delivering royal edicts while entirely unclothed, save for a sword belt slung dramatically across his hips. No one could quite agree on whether it was performance art or simply the heat. "Clothes are for the timid," he once declared, sword in one hand, decree in the other, standing atop a table like a naked philosopher. The court didn't know whether to applaud or avert their eyes. His brother, Sigismund, who had an unfortunate talent for competence, called him useless, undressed, and usually unconscious, which, to be fair, was a fairly accurate royal resume. While the nobility tiptoed around his moods and bare feet, the kingdom itself began to splinter. Factions formed, fights broke out, laws were ignored, diplomats arrived and were treated to juggling axe and mead instead of policy meetings. Eventually, even the most patient nobles realized the kingdom couldn't be run by a man whose weekly agenda included wine, wenches, and wandering shirtless through the palace gardens. In 1400, the Holy Roman electors deposed Wenceslaus as King of the Romans, citing his negligence, incapacity, and personal habits. Translation: he spent more time napping in fountains than governing. Bohemia stumbled on without him. He lived several more years in relative peace, perhaps sipping wine and wondering why people had taken his job so seriously in the first place. His legacy? A cautionary tale in royal HR. He proved that being born into power doesn't mean you're built for it, especially if your governing style involves streaking and forgetting what day it is. Even centuries later, Wenceslaus remains a favorite among historians, looking for monarchs behaving badly. He may not have passed landmark laws, but he passed out in more than one council meeting. One final note: a statue of him still stands in Prague, fully clothed. History has its limits. Few monarchs loom as large in history, or in waistline, as Henry VIII of England. A man of many talents: music, jousting, theology, and of course, serial matrimony. He was driven by unchecked power, rampant hormones, and a belief that the world, and its women, existed for his convenience. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had all the royal credentials. Spanish princess, deeply pious, loyal to the core. But after years of marriage and only one surviving child, a girl, which didn't count in Henry's dynastic math, he grew bored. Solution? Invent a church. The Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment, so Henry shrugged and said, "Fine, I'll be my own Pope." And just like that, Anglicanism was born, not from deep theological conflict, but from a stubborn man who wanted a younger wife. As one historian quipped, Henry VIII brought down Catholicism in England so he could swipe right on Anne Boleyn. Anne was smart, stylish, and had no intention of becoming a royal fling. She held out for a ring and a crown, and Henry, smitten and increasingly unhinged, gave her both. Love letters survive, florid declarations written in Henry's bold hand, full of longing and courtly praise. But Tudor romance was a high-risk job, and Anne found herself at the mercy of a king whose affections turned as quickly as his temper. When she failed to produce a male heir, again, Henry's love soured faster than old mead. Accusations flew: adultery, incest, witchcraft, the full medieval bingo card. Anne was arrested, tried, and beheaded in 1536, just 3 years after becoming queen. Her only child, Elizabeth, would one day rule England, but that was far down the line. For now, Anne's fate was a cautionary tale. Be careful what you wish for when the king is writing love poems. Henry didn't linger. Within days, he was engaged to Jane Seymour, a soft-spoken courtier who promised peace, and crucially, delivered a son. Prince Edward was born, and Henry finally had the heir he'd upended Europe to get. Jane sadly died shortly after childbirth. Henry mourned for exactly 11 days before discussing marriage again. Because if there's one thing Henry VIII loved more than power, it was not eating alone. By this point, the English court was dizzy with drama. Courtiers whispered behind fans. Nobles stayed far from chapel ceilings, just in case they were next. The Tower of London saw more royal visitors than any banquet hall. And Henry? He was just getting started. This wasn't the end of his matrimonial saga. It was the mid-season twist. 3 wives down, 3 more to go. Each one brought their own chaos, and each one made the royal advisors sweat a little harder. As one court jester may have muttered, "It's not a royal wedding until someone's executed." By now, Henry VIII's love life resembled a Tudor-themed reality show. The crown was polished, the axe was sharpened, and England braced for wife number 4. Enter Anne of Cleves, a diplomatic match painted, literally, by Hans Holbein. The portrait was charming, elegant, soft-lit. Henry said, "Lovely, I'll marry her." Then he met her in person. His verdict? She looks like a Flanders mare. A horse comparison, not exactly royal poetry. The marriage lasted 6 months. No children, no drama, just a quiet annulment and a generous pension. Anne survived by not being interesting, which, frankly, was an excellent survival strategy. Next came Catherine Howard, the 17-year-old cousin of Anne Boleyn, young, flirtatious, and dangerously unaware of Henry's gout, paranoia, and habit of beheading wives. He was 49. She was, well, not. Their courtship was brief. Their marriage was shorter. And when rumors of adultery emerged, Henry didn't write love letters. He signed the death warrant. Catherine lost her head at the Tower in 1542. She was said to have practiced her execution speech repeatedly. Romance, Tudor style. By this point, Henry was more ulcer than man. He wore padded armor, couldn't ride, and scared the courtiers just by breathing heavily. But he wasn't finished. Wife number 6? Catherine Parr, educated, composed, and fluent in not dying. She read Latin. She published books. Most importantly, she knew how to navigate the minefield that was Henry's mood swings. Agree, flatter, stay quiet, and don't die. That was her method. It worked. Catherine Parr became the only one to survive him. Not because he loved her most, but because she outlasted the ulcerous storm. When Henry died in 1547, he left behind a trail of bankrupted treasuries, a court full of trembling nobles, and a nation that had watched their king turn romance into a crime scene. One historian summed it up best. Henry VIII founded a church, executed 2 wives, fathered 3 children, and probably ate half of England's livestock. His love life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a grisly soap opera with divine right. He changed religion, like others changed clothes. He fell in and out of love with alarming speed. And each queen, in her own way, became a footnote in his obsession with legacy. 6 queens, 2 beheaded, 1 survived. The math doesn't lie. But if England needed a break, it wouldn't get one yet. Because across the channel, France had its own royal fireworks show. If the Renaissance had a prom king, Francis I of France would have worn the crown, danced with every duchess, and kissed the chaperone. He ruled from 1515 to 1547 with ink-stained fingers and a bedroom full of intrigue. A patron of the arts, Francis wooed Leonardo da Vinci himself, inviting the great man to France, where he spent his final years sketching and sipping fine wine under royal protection. Francis wasn't just a king, he was a walking oil painting, handsome, dashing, with the confidence of 10 poets and the self-control of none. His court? Less Versailles, more state-funded dating app. Historians politely refer to it as une cour galante, a court of gallantry. But let's be honest, it was Tinder with frescoes. Noblewomen were appointed to prestigious roles like gentlewomen of the bedchamber, which sounded official, but often meant on call for royal flirtation. His most famous mistress, Françoise de Foix, was a noblewoman with brains and beauty, and a husband who turned a blind eye. For nearly a decade, Françoise was queen in all but name, with pearls, palaces, and political whispers to prove it. But even Renaissance romance had an expiration date. Enter Anne de Pisseleu, clever, witty, and young. She replaced Françoise with the efficiency of a court musician changing keys. Anne wasn't just a pretty face. She advised Francis on diplomacy and literature, occasionally while he was shirtless in a chaise longue. He once told foreign ambassadors, "French kings are expected to be excellent lovers." The ambassadors nodded and took notes. Francis's bedroom was busy, but so was his mind. He reformed France's military, centralized administration, and stood toe-to-toe with Henry VIII and Charles V, Europe's other royal roosters. Unlike them, Francis did it all with lace cuffs and love letters. While Henry VIII was inventing new religions to dump wives, Francis was collecting illuminated manuscripts and mistresses, sometimes in the same room. Of course, not everyone applauded. Moralists wagged fingers, rival nobles whispered. But the French people, they adored him. Francis represented a golden moment where France flirted with modernity, danced with art, and occasionally passed love notes during cabinet meetings. Even his scandals had elegance. His reign didn't crumble under lust, it shimmered through it. He died in 1547, leaving behind a treasury in mild disrepair, a court full of poets and ex-lovers, and a reputation as the rock star of Renaissance royalty. The official epitaph might mention diplomacy and architecture, but ask the people? They remembered the charm, the flair, and the whispers behind silk curtains. He was a king of contradictions, faithful to France, faithless to his lovers. A patron of progress who couldn't resist a pretty smile, but he made the Renaissance feel alive. And while he's resting under marble now, his legacy still smells faintly of rosewater and scandal. If medieval Castile had its own telenovela, it would have been titled The King, the Queen, and the Mistress Who Lived Like One. Alfonso V, King of Castile from 1311 to 1350, had a crown on his head, but his heart elsewhere. Sure, he was married to the elegant Maria of Portugal, a woman of royal blood, diplomacy, and a jawline sharp enough to cut steel. But Alfonso's eyes? They were permanently fixed on Leonor de Guzman, his mistress, muse, and political partner in crime. Alfonso I had a wife, Maria, but his heart belonged to Leonor, the Shadow Queen. Leonor wasn't just a passing fancy, she was a dynastic earthquake. He gave her palaces, he gave her power, he gave her sons, 10 of them to be exact. Each one a walking reminder that Queen Maria had a crown, but no control. Leonor attended royal councils. She rode in golden carriages. She threw parties in castles that once belonged to queens. Maria sat alone at banquets, while Alfonso made googly eyes at Leonor. The Spanish court seethed in silence. Across the border, Maria's father, the King of Portugal, nearly launched a war over his daughter's humiliation. But Alfonso didn't care. To him, Leonor was worth it. She was bold, politically savvy, and knew how to hold a sword and a conversation. If Maria was royalty by blood, Leonor was royalty by influence. But even passion can't outrun plague. In 1350, Alfonso X marched to Gibraltar during a campaign and met an enemy he couldn't charm, the Black Death. It swept through his camp, and within days the king was gone. And suddenly, Maria was no longer powerless. She returned to court with veils of widowhood and eyes full of fury. Her husband may have left her cold and ignored in life, but in death, she was determined to take back her dignity with interest. Maria, she ended Leonor. Leonor was arrested, imprisoned, and quietly executed, far from the glitter of the court she once ruled from the shadows. Poetic justice? Perhaps. Or just the final act in a royal melodrama where love, power, and vengeance shared the same bedchamber. And what of the children Leonor bore? One of them, Henry of Trastamara, would eventually become king himself, proving that scandal has a way of rewriting history. Alfonso's reign is remembered not for great reforms or glorious battles, but for one thing: he made his mistress a monarch in everything but name. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, had the kind of cheekbones that could launch 1,000 laws, and he did. But don't let the pretty face fool you. Behind the statuesque looks and saintly posture was a king who could outmaneuver a serpent and smile while doing it. Philip the Fair, pious on the outside, reality show chaos on the inside. Philip built his reputation on piety. He waged holy wars, burned heretics, and crushed the Knights Templar for, well, their money mostly. He saw sin as something to punish, unless of course it was his own family doing the sinning. Then it became a spectacle. The Tour de Nesle affair exploded like a firework over medieval Paris. It started when Isabella, Philip's daughter and Queen of England, accused two of her sisters-in-law, Margaret and Blanche, of adultery. According to gossip, they had been entertaining knights in a tower in Paris, the Tour de Nesle, and not just for chess and tea. The Tour de Nesle affair, adultery, shaved heads, and public executions. Philip launched an investigation with the zeal of a papal inquisition, and none of the mercy. The knights were arrested, tortured, and executed in the public square. Their bones were likely still warm when Philip turned on the women. Margaret and Blanche had their heads shaved, were dressed in rags, and thrown into prison. One died within a year. The other faded into history, a royal ghost behind stone walls. And Philip? Well, he kept on collecting mistresses like tax revenue. Philip punished his daughters-in-law, but kept mistresses in the Louvre. Rules for thee, not for me. You see, Philip's piety was performance. He outlawed sin in others while rewriting morality for himself. The same man who destroyed the Templars for alleged corruption was rumored to have a private chapel and a private lover in every palace. As for Isabella, the whistleblower, her own marriage would become a royal dumpster fire when her husband, Edward II, found comfort not in her arms, but in those of men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. Irony? Isabella practically invented it. Back in France, Philip's family unraveled. His sons inherited more scandal than stability. Each married to a woman caught in the Tour de Nesle fallout, each king briefly, and each reign forgettable. Philip's legacy wasn't just a scandal, it was a curse. And maybe, just maybe, all that obsession with sin and justice wasn't about holiness at all. Maybe it was about control, about ensuring that he alone could write the rules, break them, and punish those who didn't play along. sin becomes strategy when you write the rules. If history were a masquerade ball, Sigismund of Luxembourg would be the man dancing with every lady and somehow running the empire between waltzes. Born in the late 14th century, Sigismund wore many crowns: King of Hungary, King of Germany, King of Bohemia, and finally Holy Roman Emperor. But he didn't just collect titles, he collected stories. And mistresses. Lots and lots of mistresses. Sigismund collected crowns and mistresses like wine goblets. He spoke 5 languages, had flaming red hair, and the kind of confidence that made him irresistible, even when his empire was on fire. Sigismund wasn't picky. His lovers ranged from high-born duchesses to clever laundresses to, legend has it, an opera singer he met while visiting a noble's estate. The emperor had a favorite hobby: disguise. He'd don a merchant's cloak, slap on a false mustache, and sneak into towns to flirt with local women, still proudly wearing a ring engraved with his royal crest, not the subtlest move. He dressed as a merchant to flirt, royal crest and all, subtle. Court gossip couldn't keep up. Servants whispered, monks side-eyed, and nobles rolled theirs. But Sigismund didn't care. He once said he preferred to know his people by touch and tail, which sounds poetic, until you realize he probably meant it quite literally. But underneath the silk robes and stolen kisses, Sigismund could rule. He launched crusades against the Ottomans, convened the Council of Constance to heal a fractured church, and somehow held the Holy Roman Empire together with charisma and string. He launched crusades and hosted councils, all while running Europe's wildest love life. Even his political failures came with flair. When Bohemian nobles rebelled, he called them a nest of heretics, while half his mistresses were from Bohemia. The man had range. He rode into battle in gold-threaded armor, then rode into bed with someone else's duchess. He once told a bishop that a ruler must be like water, flowing into every crevice, which, again, sounds like strategy, until you remember how often he flowed into other people's bedrooms. But in the end, Sigismund proved something rare. A scandalous ruler can still be effective, if not entirely dignified. He didn't just survive his chaos, he thrived in it. And while historians still debate his policies, everyone agrees. Europe was never bored when Sigismund was around. By the time Louis XV took the throne in 1715, France had seen everything: wars, revolutions, beheadings. So naturally, Louis gave them something new: a never-ending royal after-party. Nicknamed Louis the Beloved, he started off promising, charming, intelligent, and doted on by the public. But by mid-reign, the only thing he ruled with consistency was his libido. Louis XV turned Versailles into a royal bachelor pad. The symbol of this decadence? A place called the Parc aux Cerfs, a private house in Versailles, where young women were kept on royal rotation like some 18th century mistress carousel. Most were teenagers, plucked from families with promises of money and discretion. Louis would visit in secret, or rather, as secretly as a monarch in a golden carriage can manage. He was in love with love, but commitment, not so much. His queen, Marie Leschinska, faded into the background like a floral armchair, ornate, quiet, and rarely dusted. The queen? Like antique furniture, too expensive to toss, but irrelevant. While Louis cavorted, someone had to run the kingdom. Enter Madame de Pompadour, mistress turned best friend, political advisor, and cultural patron. She commissioned palaces, controlled appointments, and hosted salons so glamorous that Voltaire showed up just to gossip. Madame de Pompadour ran France. The Parc aux Cerfs ran his heart. Even after she and Louis stopped being lovers, she kept her grip on Versailles. She oversaw his second harem like a seasoned HR manager: rotations, discretion, and occasional emotional support. The court? A whirlwind of powdered wigs, rumors, and perfume. Foreign dignitaries tried to negotiate while sidestepping dancers, poodles, and hidden mistresses. Servants carried love notes instead of state documents. France was spinning, gorgeously, decadently, aimlessly, and as the parties raged on, the kingdom slid quietly into debt. The peasants grumbled, the nobles schemed, but Louis preferred the comfort of silk sheets over parliamentary briefs. By the end of his reign, beloved had become a punchline. He left behind a weakened monarchy, public resentment, and a palace full of mirrors reflecting nothing but self-indulgence. Still, the man knew how to throw a party. He was the last French king to rule with full absolutism and full hedonism, a golden statue wobbling on a crumbling pedestal. Versailles glittered. France groaned. If ever there was a king less suited for rule and more suited for a padded room, it was Christian VII of Denmark. He came to the throne in 1766, young, handsome, and mentally unraveling faster than a loose corset string. Christian VII, less king, more royal mascot with a cutlery obsession. Christian was afflicted with severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, though doctors at the time just called him melancholy and distracted. Distracted was one way to put it. He talked to his hand, rode imaginary horses through palace corridors, and was known to masturbate compulsively in public, which really killed the mood at formal dinners. Governance? He had no interest. He preferred whittling spoons and making inappropriate jokes at court. So into the chaos stepped Caroline Matilda, a British princess married off to this charming Danish disaster. She was intelligent, isolated, and increasingly alarmed by her husband's behavior. Eventually she found solace, and much more, in Johann Friedrich Struensee, the royal physician. Caroline Matilda expected a marriage, got a soap opera with Struensee. Struensee was everything Christian wasn't: calm, rational, progressive, and very much in love with the Queen. Soon, Struensee wasn't just warming the Queen's bed, he was running Denmark. For nearly 2 years, Struensee issued reforms in Christian's name, while the king played with toy soldiers and muttered at walls. Taxes were adjusted, censorship relaxed, and public health improved. It was the most effective Danish reign governed by someone not technically allowed to rule. Struensee ran Denmark. Christian hummed in the background. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the nobles. A palace coup was inevitable. In 1772, the affair was exposed, complete with love letters, bedroom servants' testimonies, and public outrage. Struensee was arrested and executed gruesomely, drawn, quartered, and displayed as a warning. Caroline Matilda, just 21 years old, was exiled to Germany, her children taken from her. Christian? He barely noticed. He continued wandering the palace, muttering to furniture, now just with fewer advisors to ignore him. The tragedy of Caroline Matilda is hard to overstate. Married into madness, punished for passion, and discarded by history. She died young, far from the country she once briefly ruled, an accidental queen in a kingdom of farce. After years of grim Puritan rule under Cromwell, England was in dire need of laughter, color, and cleavage. Enter Charles II, the merry monarch, who swept back from exile in 1660 with long curls, a twinkle in his eye, and zero intention of behaving. Charles II came back from exile with one goal: party hard, love harder. The restoration wasn't just political, it was personal. Charles had survived regicide, republicanism, and exile in Europe, where he'd mastered the fine arts of flirting, fleeing creditors, and sipping wine before noon. Now king, he was determined to make England fun again. And fun he made it. His court overflowed with laughter, music, theater, gambling, and, of course, mistresses. His two most famous companions? Nell Gwynn, a cheeky orange seller turned actress turned national treasure, and Barbara Palmer, the sultry, scandalous Lady Castlemaine who swung power like a mace in silk gloves. Nell Gwynn called herself the Protestant mistress, branding genius. While Barbara manipulated court politics and bore him several children, Nell won hearts with her wit and warmth. Once, when angry Londoners mistook her for a Catholic rival and booed her carriage, She stuck her head out and shouted, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore." Instant legend. Charles had at least 14 illegitimate children. He acknowledged many, gave them titles, lands, and generous pensions. He may not have left England an heir. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, remained childless, but he left half of London oddly familiar with each other. Catherine, for her part, endured it all with quiet dignity, watching as lady after lady paraded through court. Charles never abandoned her, but he didn't restrain himself either. Marriage was duty. Mistresses were destiny. His final words? "Don't let Nellie starve, not rule wisely." Classic Charles. And yet, for all the bed-hopping and champagne-sipping, Charles II was beloved. He eased tensions after Civil War, rebuilt London after the Great Fire, and gave the nation permission to smile again. He wasn't always wise, but he was human, and he ruled with a wink that made even his scandals seem endearing. Charles made monarchy a party, and everyone was invited. When he died in 1685, his court wept, and so did many women with matching dimples and suspiciously royal noses. If a Shakespearean tragedy and a soap opera had a baby in royal robes, it would be Eric XIV of Sweden. Born in 1533, crowned in 1560, Eric seemed promising at first. Handsome, artistic, obsessed with astrology, and fluent in several languages. But beneath the golden curls and velvet robes lurked a mind increasingly frayed at the seams. Eric XIV wrote sonnets, checked stars, and stabbed people mid-dinner. Eric fancied himself a romantic hero. He courted Elizabeth O'Shire of England, sending elaborate letters, charts, and even a ring. Elizabeth, ever diplomatic, ghosted him with royal finesse. Unbothered, or too deluded to notice, Eric turned his poetic gaze to Karen Mundsdottir, the daughter of a soldier, possibly a jailer, definitely not royalty. He proposed to Elizabeth first. She ghosted. He married a jailer's daughter. Karen was quiet, kind, and about as prepared for royal life as a pigeon is for parliament. But Eric loved her madly, and married her publicly, scandalizing the Swedish court. The nobles seethed. Eric didn't care. He was too busy reading horoscopes and writing love poems. But love couldn't save him from himself. Eric's paranoia grew like mold in a wine cellar. He believed his nobles plotted against him. Many probably were. But his solution? A royal dinner, with a side of stabbing. During the infamous Stour murders of 1567, Eric, mid-banquet no less, personally killed nobleman Niels Sture in a frenzy, allegedly shouting about betrayal while still holding his fork. Even his guards were stunned. The court no longer feared him. They pitied him. Stripped of power in 1568 by his own brothers, Eric was imprisoned for the rest of his life, muttering to the stars and writing wild, unhinged poetry to Karen. Some of it was beautiful. Most of it sounded like it was dictated by the moon itself. Imprisoned, he wrote love poems to Karen while ranting about the moon. Eric died in 1577, likely poisoned on orders from his brother. His last writings included rants about eclipses, doom, and heartbreak, a celestial soap opera scribbled from the shadows of a locked tower. His legacy, a cautionary tale. Don't mix unchecked power with unchecked emotion, and maybe keep the astrology chart away from the sharp cutlery. If Renaissance Italy ever needed a horror story, it found one in Ferdinand IV of Naples, a man who could quote Latin poetry by day and show off mummified corpses by night. Ferdinand IV, balanced budgets and stuffed enemies in his black room. Ruling from the mid-15th century, Ferdinand was a king of contradictions, refined and ruthless, cultured and cruel. He rebuilt Naples' economy, established a feared navy, and hosted scholars and artists. But his real passion? Taxidermy, with a twist. You see, Ferdinand didn't just collect animals. He collected enemies. Political rivals, rebellious nobles, traitors. Once executed, their bodies were embalmed and posed, dressed in the clothes they died in, and displayed in what became known as the Black Room. He gave tours of his corpse museum. One guest fainted. He laughed. It wasn't a metaphor. This was a literal room in his castle, lit dimly by torches, filled with silently grinning corpses, as if caught mid-confession. He even gave tours to foreign dignitaries, proudly showing off his macabre collection as a warning. Betray me, and you'll join the gallery. One ambassador reportedly fainted. Ferdinand chuckled, then offered wine. The corpses weren't his only indulgence. He kept a rotating cast of mistresses, ranging from noblewomen to peasant girls plucked from the street, paraded through court with zero discretion. His queen, Joanna of Aragon, faded into royal wallpaper, rarely seen and even more rarely heard. His mistresses, from peasants to nobles, discretion not included. And yet somehow, Ferdinand was popular. The nobles, they feared him, and rightly so. But the common people, they admired his strength, his decisiveness, and his uncanny ability to maintain order in a land constantly flirting with chaos. To them, the Black Room wasn't horror, it was justice with mood lighting. By the time he died in 1494, Ferdinand had held Naples together through war, rebellion, and plague, his embalmed gallery standing as both a legacy and a warning. His motto might as well have been, "Govern firmly, embalm frequently." So ends the tale of a man who proved that fear and affection can walk hand in hand, so long as one of them is stuffed and bolted to a wall. Source 19, Jerusalem. The blood of the First Crusade had dried on ancient stones, but peace was a myth. Bandits stalked the roads. Pilgrims, unarmed, devout, were slaughtered before they reached the Holy Sepulchre. Lethon 19, Jerusalem. Bandits prowled, pilgrims died. Enter Hugues de Payan. Into this chaos stepped Hugues de Payan, a French nobleman with a calling not to rule, but to serve. He and 8 companions made a vow, not to any king, not for gold or glory, but to God himself. Poverty, chastity, obedience. Their mission, to protect pilgrims on their journey to the Holy Land, armed not just with swords, but with purpose. They swore to God, not kings, no wives, no gold, just swords and faith. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But history would know them simply as the Knights Templar. They took up residence on the Temple Mount, in what was believed to be the ruins of Solomon's temple. There, in dusty chambers once sacred to prophets, they began something new, something sacred. From the ruins of Solomon's temple, the Knights Templar were born. They had no riches. Their armor was mismatched, their cloaks patched. At times, 2 knights shared a single horse, a symbol that would become their enduring emblem. And yet, they rode with a fearlessness that shook even seasoned warriors. Their vow made them free. Their faith made them fearless. They were mocked, underestimated. But they endured. And in time, their courage caught the eye of a man who would change their destiny. Bernard of Clairvaux, abbot, mystic, and the voice of Christendom. He saw in these knights not mere warriors, but a new kind of monk, a brotherhood with blades, a holy army without pride. He penned a glowing endorsement, calling them new knights for a new age, a divine fusion of monastic humility and military might. And just like that, the world began to take notice. They were poor no longer. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Knights Templar were formally recognized by the Church, thanks to one man, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard called them the new knighthood, holy warriors for God. His words thundered through Christendom. These are knights who fight not for conquest, but for Christ. His endorsement gave them legitimacy, and more importantly, donations. From France to England, Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, nobles gave land, gold, and sons to the Templars. Soon their banner, the blood-red cross, flew not just in the Holy Land, but across Europe. They answered to no king, not to dukes or barons. Only the Pope could command them. Their allegiance? To the Pope alone. Kings admired and feared them. They became a law unto themselves. a sacred elite with their own chain of command, their own fortresses, their own code. Templars did not retreat. Templars did not ransom. They fought until death, or victory. With wealth came steel, and with steel came stone. They built castles that stood like mountains on the horizon, Safed, Crac de Chevalier, Tortosa, and dozens more. Not palaces, but fortresses, walls thick as a man's reach, arrow loops in every direction, fortified prayer houses with war in their foundations. They built castles like Safed, not estates, but militarized strongholds. They patrolled the roads, escorted pilgrims, charged into battle with banners high, unflinching, unbreakable. But behind the grandeur, a shadow began to form. Templar power grew fast, too fast. Their reach spread beyond battlefields and chapels. They became landowners, administrators, bankers. Knights in armor now managed loans and treasuries. They held wealth in trust for kings, secured pilgrim money across continents, and operated an early form of international banking. In London, Paris, and Rome, the church whispered in awe, and in royal courts, others whispered with unease. Who controlled these knights? Where did their gold go? And what secrets were buried in their temples? They had become holy warriors, yes, but also something else. A power behind thrones, a kingdom within Christendom. And power, as ever, makes enemies. The sword gave them power, but the ledger gave them dominion. By the mid-12th century, the Knights Templar weren't just warriors. They were financiers, treasurers, and gatekeepers of wealth. From borrowed armor to the Swiss bank of the medieval world. Their red cross, once a symbol of sacrifice, now flew above counting houses in London, Paris, Rome, and Acre. They moved fortunes across borders without a coin leaving the vault. A pilgrim in France could deposit gold with the Templars and withdraw it in Jerusalem. They safeguarded crown jewels, funded crusades, and never defaulted. Templar strongholds became de facto banks, storing noble inheritances, royal treasuries, even the Vatican's gold. Kings trusted them with more than their armies. They owed them. But what began as reverence turned to resentment, because the Templars were untouchable. No taxes, no fealty, no oversight. They owed allegiance to the Pope alone, and the Pope liked their coin flow just fine. Meanwhile, monarchs, cash-strapped and crusade-weary, watched their debts rise. Monks with vaults? That's when kings start sharpening knives. The facade began to crack. Behind the pious image of poor warrior monks, the Templars lived in walled fortresses, wore fine armor, and conducted sophisticated financial schemes. To some, they were still saints. To others, they were holy loan sharks with swords. And suspicion breeds stories, secret rituals whispered in taverns, hidden relics buried beneath the Temple Mount. The Grail, perhaps? Or darker things. Kings owed them fortunes and couldn't control them. In truth, the Templars remained devout, but devotion doesn't cancel envy. They had become too big, too rich, and too independent. And as their banks flourished, their military edge dulled. The Crusader states, once their proving ground, were crumbling, and on the horizon loomed a name whispered with fear: Saladin. They were forged for war, but what happens when the war is lost? Hatton, 1187, a date burned into Crusader memory. The hills of Galilee shimmered with heat and blood. Saladin, the warrior sultan, encircled the Crusaders near the horns of Hatton. Outnumbered, dehydrated, and surrounded, the Templars stood their ground. For a moment. Then came collapse. Hatton, 1187. Saladin crushed the Templars, no mercy for the Red Cross. Those taken alive, especially the Templar Knights, were deemed too dangerous to ransom. Saladin ordered their execution. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, beheaded by scimitar. The Red Cross soaked in redder blood. Jerusalem fell. The Holy City, once the Templars' sacred mission, was gone. The Third Crusade followed, bringing legends like Richard the Lionheart to the fray. But even Richard couldn't reclaim Jerusalem. Only deals, truces, and fleeting victories. The Templars fought on, But the tide had turned. For a century they lingered, defending coastal strongholds like Tyre, Tripoli, and finally, Acre. 1291. Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, was besieged. The Templars defended it to the last man, and when the city burned, so did the dream. Acre fell in 1291. The Holy Land was gone, and so was their purpose. The surviving knights fled to Cyprus. They had their armor, their rituals, and their vast wealth. But no holy war, no sacred ground, no cause. And so the whispers began. Whispers grew. Too rich, too secretive, hoarding dangerous relics. They still had their fortresses. They still had their banks. But now, they were a sword with no war. Europe began to murmur. Why do these monks train like soldiers? Why are they richer than kings? What do they keep in their vaults? Some said the Ark of the Covenant. Others said Satan's gospel. Rumor didn't need truth. It just needed fear. And fear was a currency now more valuable than gold. The Templars, once seen as God's chosen, now looked more like a private army in exile. And someone would decide to cash in. By 1307, the Templars had no enemies in Jerusalem. But in Paris, they had one. Philip IV, King of France. And he didn't need swords. He had paper, ink, and chains. Philip IV owed the Templars millions. His solution? Arrest them all. He was broke. The Templars were not. They held French crown jewels in safekeeping. They had more gold than the royal treasury. And worst of all, they answered to the Pope, not to him. So Philip made his move, not on a battlefield, but in the shadows. He launched a propaganda campaign, whispered rumors of heresy, devil worship, blasphemy. He planted spies, gathered signatures, bribed clergy, and then came the day. Friday, October 13th, 1307, a day that would stain calendars forever. Friday the 13th, 1307, Templars dragged from beds, charged with devil worship. At dawn, across all of France, Templars were seized. Old knights, young squires, commanders in prayer. They were shackled and accused of unspeakable acts, spitting on the cross, worshipping a cat-headed idol called Baphomet, kissing each other obscenely during secret rituals. The public gasped. The church hesitated, and Philip smiled. Torture made truth easy. Thumbscrews, the rack. Fires lit not for warmth, but for pain. Under torture, even Jacques de Molay confessed, then recanted. Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Templars, held firm, then broke, then held firm again. His confession, dragged from him under agony, was read aloud. Later, with pride, he publicly recanted, shouting that he had lied under torture. It was too late. The damage was done. The Templars' honor was bleeding out in a dungeon, and while some looked away in shame, others looked on in triumph. Philip had what he wanted. Money seized, order dismantled, threat removed. Justice? That was someone else's problem. The sword didn't end them. A scroll did. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, Pope Clement V, under pressure from Philip IV, issued a papal bull. With a stroke of the pen, the Knights Templar were dissolved. 8 centuries of oaths, battles, and sacrifice vanished into ink. 1312, the Templars were erased by a papal bull, but their wealth vanished. But not everything disappeared. Templar castles stood empty. Vaults, cleaned out, relics, missing. The treasure Philip hoped to seize, gone. The most feared banking order in Europe had quietly outmaneuvered its king. Then came the fire. March 18th, 1314. A pyre was built on the banks of the Seine. Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master, stood atop it. Chained, silent, eyes on the crowd. When the flames reached his feet, he spoke. Not in pain, but prophecy. Jacques de Molay cursed his killers as flames rose. They died within a year. He called upon Philip IV and Pope Clement to answer before God within a year. The crowd shivered. The air held its breath. Within months, Pope Clement, dead. Philip IV, dead. The Capetian line, broken within a generation. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe something older stirred, watching from the ashes. The Templars were gone, but not forgotten. Their wealth never found. Their secrets never explained. And so the myths began. The Templars didn't die. They became myths, Grail guardians, secret societies. Some said they smuggled treasure across Europe. Others believed they fled to Scotland, hiding among stonemasons who would become the Freemasons. Still more whispered they protected the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or even the bloodline of Christ. Every century added new shadows to their story. Books, scrolls, symbols on cathedral walls. They weren't just knights anymore. They were ghosts in history, guardians of forgotten knowledge. You can almost feel them, standing silent in ruined fortresses, beneath cathedrals, watching from stained glass. And somewhere in the dark, the legend persists. The Templars did not fall. They hid. They wait. 1163 Paris, a city of narrow streets, flickering torches and rising dreams. Amid its bustling chaos stood Bishop Maurice de Sully, gazing across the Ile de la Cité. Where goats grazed and old Roman ruins slumped in silence, he envisioned a cathedral, not merely of stone and glass, but of light, grace, and faith. 1163. Paris. Maurice de Sully dreamed of a cathedral to humble the soul. It would rise not as a fortress, but as a prayer in stone. Taller, finer, holier than anything France had ever dared. He gathered artists, theologians, masons, and dreamers. And in the spring of that same year, Pope Alexander III himself laid the first stone, blessing a construction that would outlive kings, wars, and plagues. Pope Alexander III laid the first stone, launching a generational vow. There were no cranes, no steel, only hands, pulleys, and faith. Masons shaped limestone with wooden mallets. Carpenters carved timbers taller than towers. Fathers trained sons, sons trained grandsons. Sons inherited chisels from fathers, building for God, not fame. Each carving, each window, each vaulted arch whispered upward. We were here. It was not one project. It was a chain of generations, united by belief. Each life spent on a fragment, never the whole. Rain lashed their scaffolding. Frost split their fingers. But they built. Because what they built was not for themselves. It was for God. It was for the soul of Paris. Slowly, the towers began to rise, defiant against time, stretching toward the heavens. Inside, darkness melted beneath colored light. Flying buttresses leaned like angels at their flanks. Statues spoke in silence, and the great rose window bloomed. From a bishop's vision came a monument of faith, fear, and human will. By the 13th century, the silhouette of Notre-Dame de Paris had become more than just a landmark. It was a revelation in stone. Its flying buttresses soared outward like wings, lifting the cathedral's towering nave as though defying gravity itself. These sweeping arches weren't merely structural. They were statements of divine ambition, engineering marvels meant to draw eyes and souls upward. The rose windows, immense, kaleidoscopic blooms of stained glass, captured sunlight and transformed it into prayer. The western facade stood like a royal tapestry of stone, lined with the gallery of kings, each statue silently declaring the marriage of monarchy and faith. Even the smallest chisel mark served a purpose, to make the heavens visible on earth. Above it all rose the spire, slender and defiant, pointing to eternity. Perched along the eaves, grotesque gargoyles watched over the city, protectors in monstrous form, blending superstition and symbolism. Some whispered they scared off evil. Others said they simply reminded us to look skyward, even in fear. Notre-Dame was not just built, it was inherited. Generations passed the project down like a sacred trust. Sons of stonemasons carved blocks where their fathers once stood. Every ribbed vault and pointed arch echoed centuries of faith, patience, and painstaking labor. Notre-Dame was a dream in stone, where light became prayer. Over the centuries, Notre-Dame bore witness to history's grandeur and tragedy. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself emperor beneath its soaring vaults, turning the sacred altar into a stage for imperial drama. Through revolutions, wars, and restorations, the cathedral endured, adapting, but never yielding. Then came the fire. In April 2019, flames consumed the spire and roof, collapsing centuries in minutes. Parisians gathered in the streets, singing hymns through tears. The world watched as smoke curled above the Seine, and 1,000 years of memory trembled. But Notre-Dame did not fall. Its bell towers stood. Its heart still beat. From coronations to conflagrations, Notre-Dame remained France's spiritual and cultural soul. From Napoleon to the 2019 fire, Notre-Dame has been the heart of France. It was more than a building. It was memory, identity, prayer, and poetry etched in limestone. As restorers now work stone by stone to heal its wounds, a new story begins to rise beside the old. One of resilience, one of awe, one of reverence, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. And from the shadowed nave of Notre-Dame, we now journey to a very different cathedral, this one carved not in stone, but on the waves. A woman, feared and revered, commands the South China Sea. Her name, Zheng Yi Sao, and she is about to reshape history. She was born in 1775 in the coastal shadows of Guangdong, a girl with no name history would remember. At least, not yet. Known then only as a courtesan aboard a floating brothel, she learned to navigate the whims of power long before she ever took to sea. But fate, like the tide, would soon shift. She married Zheng Yi, a formidable pirate captain of the Red Flag Fleet, and quickly proved she was more than a consort. She was an operator, a strategist, quietly learning, quietly rising. When Zheng Yi died suddenly in 1807, the fleet expected chaos. Instead, they found command. Zheng Yi Sao stepped into the void, seized power, and remade the fleet in her image. By sheer force of will, and no small measure of brilliance, she forged a maritime empire the world had never seen. At its height, the Red Flag Fleet boasted over 1,800 ships and commanded upwards of 70,000 men. 1,800 ships, 70,000 souls. She built a floating nation. But she ruled not with cruelty, but code. Zheng Yi Sao instituted a strict set of laws that would rival any navies. Loot was to be shared equitably. Women, whether captured or enlisted, were to be protected, not exploited. Defiance was punished harshly, loyalty rewarded generously. Her discipline turned a loose confederation of pirates into a disciplined, near-invincible force. Imperial China took notice. The Qing dynasty launched campaign after campaign to crush her. Portugal and Britain joined the fight, uneasy with a pirate queen who defied empires. But time and again, Zheng Yi Sao prevailed. She outmaneuvered fleets, broke sieges, and turned naval might into scattered wreckage. The Qing tried to crush her, but she won every time. She became more than a pirate. She was a legend, whispered in fear by emperors and in awe by the people. She challenged dynasties, defied colonial powers, and rewrote the rules of the sea, all on her own terms. Zheng Yi Sao rose from courtesan to queen of the seas, on her terms. And then, just as astonishingly as she had risen, she chose to walk away. We now follow her not into battle, but into the halls of negotiation, where her greatest act of leadership awaits. By 1810, Zheng Yi Sao had nothing left to prove, but everything to preserve. She entered negotiations with the Qing dynasty not as a fugitive, but as a sovereign force. In Guangzhou, amid the tense halls of diplomacy, she secured the unthinkable. A full pardon not just for herself, but for over 17,000 pirates under her command. No chains, no trials, only freedom. Zheng Yi Sao demanded peace on her terms, and won. She retired not in hiding, but in daylight. She opened a gambling house in Guangdong and lived peacefully until her death in 1844, She was never captured, never betrayed. She simply stepped back, her name already etched into the currents of history. And yet, the West rarely speaks her name. The most successful pirate in history, a woman who commanded more ships than Blackbeard, more power than Drake, remains for many a forgotten legend. But her legacy endures on the winds of the South China Sea, in the quiet code of defiance and dignity she left behind. Her story, like Notre-Dame's spires or the Templars' mysteries, reminds us that greatness is not always gilded in gold. Sometimes, it rises from stone. Sometimes, it sails with a red flag. And sometimes, it survives through silence and time. From the soaring arches of Notre-Dame to the whispered oaths of the Templars and the roaring waves beneath Zheng Yi Sao's fleet, we have wandered through power shaped by faith, secrecy, and rebellion. Each tale echoes a truth older than empires, that those who dare to shape the world, truly shape it, do not always wait for permission. Notre-Dame, battered by time and fire, still stands. The Templars, though vanished, still haunt our myths, and Zheng Yi Sao, once a courtesan, now sails forever in the legends of the sea. Notre-Dame, the Templars, Zheng Yi Sao, each teaches us this: greatness never dies. As our story closes, we are left not with endings, but with echoes, reminders that strength, conviction, and legacy do not belong only to kings and conquerors. They rise wherever someone dares to dream beyond their station and fight for more than survival. History whispers to the present, and if we listen, we find the courage to build, to believe, and perhaps even to rise.